The wind had teeth, and it had been chewing on the stagecoach for the last 50 miles. It screamed across the plains, hurling grit and sand against the thin wooden walls until the world outside was nothing but a brown, howling blur. When the wheels finally groaned to a stop, the sudden silence felt heavier than the noise. This was Redemption Creek. It did not look like a place of salvation. Evelyn Hayes stepped down onto the hard-packed earth, her city shoes sinking into a fine layer of dust. The wind immediately tore at her, pulling strands of hair from her neat bun and whipping her skirts around her ankles. In her arms, she clutched a bundle of white linen and lace, the fabric crushed into a wrinkled ball. It was her wedding dress, carried all the way from Pennsylvania, a symbol of a promise she was no longer certain she wanted to keep. Her knuckles were white where she gripped the cloth, a desperate anchor in a world that had suddenly come loose from its moorings. The town was little more than a single, wide street lined with tired-looking buildings, their false fronts leaning like old men bracing against the gale. A saloon, a general store, a blacksmith's forge gone cold. There was no welcoming party, no smiling face to greet her. The few people who were out and about, heads bowed against the dust, glanced at her, a woman alone, with Eastern clothes and a haunted look in her eyes, and then quickly looked away. They knew who she was, the mail-order bride for Frank Dobbs. Their pity was a tangible thing, thin and sharp as a needle. A woman sweeping the porch of the general store finally took a sliver of mercy on her. "You'll be looking for Mr. Dobbs," she said, not as a question. Her voice was flat, worn smooth by the wind. "He ain't here. You're to wait at the inn. He'll fetch you for the preachin' tonight." The words hung in the air. Fetch you, like a piece of cargo, a delivery to be collected at his convenience. A cold knot formed in Evelyn's stomach. She had spent 2 months reading his letters, words full of promises of a respectable life, a fine home, and security for her family back east. He had written of his vast lands and his standing in the community. He had not written about a welcome as cold and empty as a winter grave. "Thank you," Evelyn murmured, her voice barely a whisper. She walked toward the inn, the sign swinging on a single hinge, creaking a lonely rhythm. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of stale beer and desperation. A few grim-faced men sat at tables, nursing glasses of whiskey, their eyes following her as she approached the counter. She felt like a specimen under glass, a strange creature washed up on their shores. She paid for a room she prayed she would not have to use for long, the innkeeper's eyes lingering on the crumpled dress in her arms. She could not bear the thought of sitting in that stuffy room, of breathing in the silence and her own fear. She needed air, even if it was full of sand. Leaving her trunk by the door, she stepped back outside and walked, her feet carrying her toward the edge of town, where the buildings gave way to the endless, aching expanse of the frontier. That was where she saw him, a man, tall and lean, his back to the wind as he worked on a stretch of broken fence. The rails had splintered, and he was methodically, patiently, setting a new post. He moved with a quiet economy, no wasted motion, his focus entirely on the task at hand. He seemed a part of the landscape, as sturdy and weathered as the cedar posts he was tamping into the ground. He wore worn denim and a faded flannel shirt, his hat pulled low against the dust. Evelyn stopped a dozen yards away, not wanting to intrude but unable to pull her gaze away. There was a calmness about him that was the exact opposite of the turmoil raging inside her. She shivered, a tremor that had nothing to do with the evening chill and everything to do with the cold dread that had been seeping into her bones all day. He must have sensed her presence. He stopped his work, straightened up slowly, and turned. His face was angular, tanned by the sun, with lines around his eyes that spoke of long days spent squinting into the horizon. They were kind eyes, she noted, a soft gray like a morning mist. There was a scar, a thin white line that cut through his left eyebrow and disappeared into his hairline. But it did not make him look menacing. It only made him look like a man who had endured things. He did not speak, just watched her for a moment, his gaze taking in her fine but dusty dress, her pale face, her shivering frame. Then, without a word, he took off his canvas coat. It was worn and frayed at the cuffs, smelling faintly of leather and clean sweat. He walked over to her and held it out. "You look cold, ma'am," he said. His voice was low and soft, a gentle rumble that was nearly lost in the wind, but it cut through the noise and settled something deep inside her. She was too stunned to refuse. She allowed him to drape the heavy coat over her shoulders. The warmth of it was immediate, a shield against the biting air and the colder stares of the town. It was far too big for her, the sleeves hanging down past her hands. But she pulled it tight around herself, an act of gratitude so profound it left her speechless. "My name is Jesse," he said, filling the silence. "Jesse Kane." "Evelyn Hayes," she managed to reply. He nodded, as if her name was all he needed to know. Best to get back inside before this storm really lets loose. The sky's looking mean. He was right. The clouds on the horizon were bruised, a deep purple-black that promised a violent night. She should have gone back to her room, but the thought of returning to that oppressive silence was unbearable. I was just getting some air." "Not much of it out here but dust," he said with a small, sad smile that did not quite reach his eyes. He turned back to his fence post as if the conversation was over, granting her the privacy of her own thoughts. Yet he did not put his coat back on. He worked in his shirt sleeves, the wind plastering the thin flannel to his broad shoulders. The simple, selfless gesture was more kindness than anyone had shown her since she'd left home. She found herself walking back toward the inn, Jesse's coat a tangible weight on her shoulders, a strange comfort in a strange land. When she pushed open the door, the warmth and noise of the place hit her. The room was more crowded now, with ranch hands and drifters seeking refuge from the coming storm. A man at the bar, his face flushed with drink, turned as she entered. His eyes, small and piggish, raked over her, lingering on the expensive fabric of her dress visible beneath the rough coat. "Well now," he slurred, pushing himself off his stool and swaggering toward her. "Look what the wind blew in. It's Dobbs's mail-order meat." The room went quiet. The other men watched, some with amusement, some with a weary sort of disinterest. Evelyn froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. The man's breath was foul, a mix of whiskey and rot. He reached out and grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh like talons. "A pretty little thing, ain't ya?" he sneered, pulling her closer. "Come all this way for old man Dobbs? He must have paid a fine price for a piece like you." Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. She tried to pull away, but his grip was like iron. "Let go of me," she said, her voice trembling. His laugh was a wet, ugly sound. "Feisty. I like that. Maybe before Dobbs claims his property, you and I could... I think the lady wants to be left alone." The voice was the same one she'd heard by the fence line, low and calm, yet it sliced through the saloon's grubby atmosphere with the clean edge of a knife. Jesse stood just inside the doorway, his hat in his hands. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't made a threatening move, but every man in the room, including the drunk holding her arm, turned to look at him. His presence seemed to fill the space, his quiet stillness more intimidating than any loud threat. The drunk squinted. "This ain't your business, Kane." "You put your hands on her," Jesse said, his voice dropping even lower. "That makes it my business." He took a slow step forward. He was not a large man, not bulky, but he moved with a coiled grace that promised he could handle himself. The man hesitated, his whiskey-fueled courage beginning to sour. He looked from Jesse's calm, steady gaze to Evelyn's frightened face. With a grunt, he shoved her away from him and stumbled back to his stool, muttering curses into his glass. Jesse waited a moment, making sure the threat was gone, before he turned his attention to her. "Are you all right, Miss Hayes?" She could only nod, her throat too tight for words. She was rubbing her arm where the man's fingers had dug in, a faint red mark already beginning to bloom on her skin. "Let's get you out of here," he said gently. He guided her not toward the stairs to her room, but toward a small table in a quiet corner, away from the prying eyes of the bar. He pulled out a chair for her and then sat opposite, placing his hat on the table. For a long while, they just sat in silence, the low murmur of the saloon a backdrop to the storm gathering in Evelyn's heart. Finally, she found her voice. "Thank you," she whispered, looking down at her hands. He was awful." "Some men are," Jesse replied simply. "This town's got its share." He paused, his gray eyes studying her with a gentle intensity. "You shouldn't be in a place like this alone." A tear she hadn't realized was forming slipped down her cheek and fell onto the rough wood of the table. "I shouldn't be here at all," she confessed, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "This isn't what I was promised." Jesse just listened, his patience a vast, open space that invited her to fill it. And so she did. She told him about her family in Pennsylvania, about her father's failing health and the debts piling up. She told him of Frank Dobbs' letters, filled with elegant prose that spoke of partnership and respect, of building a life together under the wide western sky. "He made it sound like a new beginning," she said, her voice thick with unshed tears. "A chance to provide for my sisters, to make sure my mother was cared for. He sent money for the journey, for the dress. He made it all seem so respectable." "And now?" Jesse prompted softly. Evelyn swallowed hard. "On the stagecoach, people talked. They didn't know who I was. They spoke of a man named Dobbs, a rich man, a hard man, a man whose first 2 wives died young." She looked up at him, her eyes wide with a fear she had been trying to suppress for days. "And when I arrived today, and he wasn't here, the way people look at me, like I'm already a ghost." She shuddered, pulling his coat tighter around her. "They say he has a temper, that he kept his last wife, Martha, locked away in that big house of his, that no one saw her for months before she passed." Jesse's expression hardened, the lines around his eyes deepening. He did not seem surprised by her words. He seemed to be confirming something he already knew. "Evelyn," he said, using her first name for the first time. It sounded solid and real in his mouth. "Some stories in a small town get stretched, but the ones about Frank Dobbs, they're mostly true. He's a man who believes everything, and everyone, is for sale. He sees people as possessions." He leaned forward slightly, his gaze unwavering. Marrying him would be a mistake. A cage is a cage, no matter how big the house around it. His words were a cold splash of water, washing away the last of her desperate hopes. She had known it, in her gut, but to hear it said aloud made it terrifyingly real. "I can't go back," she whispered, a new wave of despair washing over her. "My family is counting on the money he promised. They sacrificed so much for me to come here. To turn back now, it would ruin them. I am trapped." He did not offer easy solutions or false comfort. He simply sat with her, a silent witness to her quiet desperation. The weight of his understanding was a strange and heavy comfort. After a time, he stood. "It's getting late. The wedding is set for 9. I'll walk you to the chapel." It was not the offer she wanted, but it was the one reality demanded. She nodded numbly, her fate feeling as sealed and certain as the storm that was now breaking over the town. Rain began to lash against the windows, driven by a furious wind. They walked the short distance to the small, clapboard chapel at the end of the street. The wind tore at them, and Jessie had to put a steadying hand on her back to keep her from stumbling. The church was empty save for a dour-faced preacher who was lighting oil lamps, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. "Mr. Dobbs is on his way," the preacher said without looking at them. "He sent word. You're to wait." Jessie's hand fell from her back. "I'll leave you then. Miss Hayes." His eyes held a deep, unspoken sorrow. He looked as if he were leaving a lamb to the slaughter. He turned to go, but Evelyn's hand shot out and caught his sleeve. "Please," she whispered. "Don't go. Not yet." She could not bear to be alone. He hesitated, then gave a slight nod and moved to sit in the back pew, a silent, solitary guardian. Evelyn felt a pull toward the small churchyard beside the chapel. She needed a moment, a breath of air before the end. She pushed open a side door and stepped into the rain-soaked cemetery. The wind howled through the few scraggly pines, and the headstones listed like crooked teeth. It did not take her long to find the one she was looking for. Martha Dobbs, beloved wife, taken by the Lord. The stone was already stained with weather, though it could not have been more than a year old. At its base lay a small cluster of wildflowers, already wilting. Someone in town pitied her, but what caught Evelyn's eye was the stone itself. Near the top, a piece of the marble was chipped away, and a thin, dark crack spider-webbed down from it, like the memory of a violent blow. It looked like a bruise, carved in stone. Her blood ran cold. This was not a memorial, it was a warning. A carriage rattled up the road, the horses snorting and stamping in the mud. The chapel door opened, and a large figure filled the doorway. Frank Dobbs had arrived. He was an older man, as his letters had suggested, but where she had imagined a distinguished gentleman, she saw a man run to seed. His face was florid, his belly straining the buttons of his fine waistcoat. His eyes were bloodshot, and he smelled powerfully of whiskey and anger. "There you are, girl," he boomed, his voice grating. "Had me waiting. I don't like to be kept waiting." He strode toward her, his boots loud on the wooden floorboards. He took her arm in the very same way the drunk at the inn had, a grip of ownership, of possession. His fingers were thick and hard, and she flinched from his touch. I am sorry," she stammered. "The stage was late." "Excuses," he spat, his eyes narrowing. He looked her up and down, his gaze a physical violation. "Take that ridiculous coat off. You're here to be my wife, not a stable hand." He yanked Jessie's coat from her shoulders and tossed it onto a pew without a second glance. The warmth was gone, and the cold of the room seeped back into her. The preacher cleared his throat, and the grim ceremony began. Frank Dobbs' hand was a sweaty vice on her arm. His breath was hot and sour against her cheek. The preacher's words droned on, a meaningless litany of holy matrimony and sacred vows, to love, honor, and obey. Evelyn's gaze drifted to the back of the chapel. Jessie was still there, his face set like stone, his eyes locked on hers. In them, she saw not judgment, but a deep, aching sadness. He was not here to stop this. He was here to bear witness. The storm outside crashed, a loud peal of thunder shaking the small building. The preacher said, Evelyn Hayes, take this man." The wind screamed. The rain hammered on the roof. The bruised gravestone flashed in her mind. She saw the leering face of the drunk, felt the crushing grip of the man beside her. She looked at Jessie's steady face one last time, a silent plea and a silent goodbye. This was not a wedding, it was a sentence, and she would not serve it. Before the preacher could finish, before Dobbs could react, Evelyn wrenched her arm free. She did not scream, she did not cry. She simply turned and ran. She bolted out the chapel door and into the raging storm. The pristine white hem of her wedding dress instantly soaked and splattered with mud. She heard Dobbs roar her name behind her, a sound of pure fury. She did not look back. She ran blindly, the rain plastering her hair to her face, the wind trying to shove her back. She did not know where she was going, only that she was running away from the chapel, away from the town, away from Frank Dobbs. Her feet, guided by some desperate instinct, found the path leading out of Redemption Creek. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs ached, until the lights of the town were swallowed by the rain and the dark. She stumbled through the mud and the scrub, guided only by the faint memory of a man mending a fence. Finally, through the sheeting rain, she saw it, a flicker of light, warm and yellow, a single lamp burning in a cabin window. She collapsed against the solid wood of the door, her knuckles banging against it weakly. Her beautiful dress was ruined, torn and filthy. Her body trembled from cold and terror. The door swung open. Jesse stood there, his silhouette framed by the warm light of the fire behind him. He looked down at her, his face unreadable in the shadows. He did not look surprised to see her. Water dripped from her hair and ran in rivulets down her face, mixing with the tears she no longer tried to hold back. She was broken, empty, with nowhere left to run. "Please," she choked out, her voice a raw, broken thing. "Don't ask me any questions. Just let me stay. For the night." He did not ask her to explain. He simply stepped back, holding the door open against a gust of wind that threatened to tear it from its hinges, and let her stumble inside. He shut the door behind her, and the roar of the storm was instantly muffled, replaced by the low moan of the wind in the chimney and the sharp crackle of embers in the hearth. The world outside was chaos. Inside this small, single room was a fragile sanctuary. The cabin was sparse, built of necessity and not for comfort. A simple cot was pushed against one wall, a single thick quilt folded neatly upon it. A rough-hewn table and 2 chairs stood in the center of the room. A stone fireplace dominated the far wall, its hearth swept clean. Everything had its place. It was the home of a man who lived alone and expected no company. Evelyn stood dripping on the packed earth floor, a pathetic specter in her ruined finery. The cold had seeped deep into her bones, and she trembled so violently she could hear her own teeth chattering. Jesse moved without a word. He took a heavy wool blanket from a wooden chest at the foot of his bed and draped it around her shoulders. The scratchy warmth of it was a shock, a sudden comfort so profound it almost brought her to her knees. He went to the fire, added a few split logs from a tidy stack nearby, and coaxed the embers back to life. Flames licked up the wood, casting a warm, flickering light that danced across the cabin walls and pushed back the shadows. He filled a tin kettle with water from a bucket and set it on a hook over the growing fire. All his movements were quiet and deliberate, possessed of a patience that seemed to be his very nature. He was careful not to look at her directly, granting her the dignity of her sorrow, his gaze fixed on his tasks. He did not stare at the way the wet linen of her dress clung to her form, or at the mud caked to its delicate lace hem. He simply treated her like a person in need of warmth, not an object of curiosity. He brought her a steaming mug of hot water, his calloused fingers brushing hers for a fleeting second as he handed it to her. The raw heat of the tin cup was a welcome pain, a grounding sensation. She wrapped her frozen hands around it, letting the steam rise and bathe her face. She sat in one of the wooden chairs, the blanket pulled tight around her, a small, huddled figure in the vast, howling wilderness. Her eyes fell to the hem of her dress, pooled on the floor around her feet. The white fabric was stained with the brown mud of the trail, and a long tear ran up the side where it had caught on a thorny bush. Her hand, still shaking, reached down and touched the ruined lace. It was supposed to be the symbol of her new life, a pristine beginning. Now it was just a testament to her failure, her foolishness. A single, dry sob escaped her lips, a sound of utter desolation. She looked up at Jesse, who was watching the fire, his profile etched in gold and shadow. "This is my wedding night," she whispered, her voice so low it was nearly lost in the wind's cry. The words hung in the small space between them, heavy with all the things they implied. A broken vow, a shattered dream, a terrifying and unknown future. Jesse turned his head slowly, his gray eyes meeting hers. There was no pity in them, only a deep, quiet understanding. He did not say, "I told you so." He did not ask what had happened. He had seen it all in her face the moment he opened the door. He let the silence sit for a long moment before he spoke. "You get some rest," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You can have the bed. I'll sleep out in the lean-to with the horses. They're good company." He was already reaching for his coat, the one Dobbs had so carelessly tossed aside, which he had retrieved from the chapel. He was offering her not just his bed, but the safety of his absence, a gesture of respect so profound it made her ache. But the thought of being alone, of lying in the dark with only the sound of the storm and the terror in her own mind for company, was more than she could bear. The wind rattled the window pane, and it sounded like fingers scrabbling to get in. "No," she said, her voice stronger now. He stopped, his hand on the door latch. "Please, I do not want to be alone." She looked down at her hands, ashamed of her own weakness but unable to hide it. "I want someone to stay, just for tonight." He stood there for a beat, his back to her. She could not see his face, could not guess at his thoughts. He was a stranger. She had no right to ask anything of him, but he had shown her more kindness in a few short hours than she had known in months. He was the only anchor she had in a world that was trying to tear her apart. Finally, he turned around, his expression unreadable. He took his hand off the latch and hung his coat on a wooden peg by the door. "All right," he said softly. "I'll stay." He pulled the other chair closer to the fire and sat down, leaving a respectable distance between them. And so they sat, two strangers bound by a storm, listening to the crackle of the flames and the howling of the wind. The heat from the fire began to seep into Evelyn's chilled limbs, slowly unknotting the tension in her shoulders. The silence in the cabin was a living thing, a space for her to simply be, without expectation or demand. And in that safe, quiet space, she finally let herself break. The tears came not in a rush, but as a slow, silent overflow. They traced paths down her dust-streaked cheeks and fell onto the rough wool of the blanket. She did not make a sound, but her whole body shook with the force of her weeping. It was a grief for the life she had lost, for the family she had failed, and for the innocence that had been stripped from her in a single, brutal day. Jesse did not move. He did not try to comfort her with empty words or awkward pats on the shoulder. He simply sat there, his presence a steady, unwavering wall against the storm inside and out. He let her cry until there were no tears left, until she was hollowed out and exhausted, the silence returning to the small cabin, heavier now, but cleaner. When her trembling had finally subsided, he spoke, his voice low and even, as if he were talking to a frightened horse. "I knew a woman once," he began, his eyes fixed on the dancing flames. "Her name was Sarah. Grew up just over the ridge from here, hair the color of corn silk. She could ride a horse better than any man I ever knew." Evelyn listened, her own sorrow momentarily forgotten, caught up in the gentle rhythm of his storytelling. "We were to be married," he went on, a sad, distant smile touching his lips. "I was building a cabin for us, bigger than this one, down in the canyon where the cottonwoods grow. We were going to raise horses and children." He fell silent for a moment, the fire crackling in the quiet. "Then the fever came through that winter. It took a lot of good people. It took her." He stared deep into the heart of the fire, as if he could see her face there in the embers. "I buried her myself, down in that canyon, right where our front door would have been. I haven't touched another woman since." He did not tell the story for pity, or to compare their griefs. He told it to let her know that he understood loss, that he knew what it was to have a future snatched away in an instant. He was sharing a piece of his own brokenness to make room for hers. The confession settled in the space between them, a bond forged in shared pain. Evelyn looked at this quiet, gentle man, and for the first time since stepping off that stagecoach, she did not feel entirely alone. His grief was an old, weathered thing, while hers was still a raw, open wound, but they were born of the same world, a world that took and rarely gave back. Slowly, awkwardly. She rose from her chair. The wet dress was cold and heavy against her skin, a constant reminder of her flight. Beneath it, the tight lacing of her corset dug into her ribs, a cage of whalebone and propriety that she could no longer bear. Her fingers, numb and clumsy, fumbled with the laces at her back. I cannot breathe in this," she stammered, her voice raspy. Jesse stood, his instinct to help warring with his need to give her space. He took a half step toward her, then stopped. She finally managed to loosen the knot. Pulling the laces free, the corset fell away, and she could suddenly draw a full, deep breath. The relief was so immense it made her dizzy. She turned slightly, her back to the firelight, and as she did, the light caught the dark, ugly marks on her skin. A series of deep purple bruises marred the pale flesh of her upper back and shoulder, the clear imprint of a man's powerful, angry grip where Dobbs had seized her in the chapel. Her breath hitched, and she instinctively moved to cover herself, but then she stopped. She looked at Jesse, her eyes pleading. "Do not turn away," she whispered. He did not. His gaze moved from her face to the marks on her back, and a muscle tightened in his jaw. A cold, quiet anger flared in his eyes, an anger on her behalf. He saw not a fallen woman, but a wounded one. He saw the truth of her story written on her skin. He simply nodded, his face a grim mask of understanding. The night was wearing on. The fire had burned down to a bed of glowing coals. The storm had not lessened its fury. "You should sleep," he said, his voice rough with emotion. She nodded, too exhausted to argue. She walked to the cot and pulled back the heavy quilt. She lay down, still in her damp chemise, the ruined dress lying in a heap on the floor. The bed was narrow, barely big enough for one person. She curled onto her side, facing the wall, making herself as small as possible. Jesse took the remaining blanket from the chest and laid it out on the floor before the hearth, as far from her as the small room would allow. But as he went to lie down, her voice, small and trembling, stopped him. "Will you?" She hesitated, the request so bold it terrified her. "The floor is cold. There is room." He stood frozen for a long moment, the blanket in his hands. He knew what she was asking, and what she was not. It was not an invitation, but a plea for human warmth, for a solid presence to ward off the nightmares that were waiting for her behind her closed eyes. Slowly, he walked to the cot. He lay down on his back on the very edge of the mattress, his body rigid, careful not to touch her. The space between them was a chasm, charged with unspoken fears and nascent desires. He pulled the heavy quilt over both of them. Nothing happened. They lay there in the near dark, listening to each other's breathing. Her breaths were shallow and shaky. His were slow and measured, a forced calmness. But beneath the surface, he could feel the pull, the undeniable awareness of the woman lying beside him. He could smell the rain in her hair, the scent of lavender from some sachet she must have packed in her trunk. He fought it, fought the feelings that he had buried long ago with Sarah. This woman was vulnerable, terrified. She was not for him. And yet, he could not deny the truth. He had not felt this alive, this painfully aware, in years, as if she could read his thoughts. Evelyn spoke, her voice a fragile murmur against the rough pillow. "I need to feel wanted," she said, so quietly he almost thought he'd imagined it. "Just once, not bought." The simple, heartbreaking confession shattered the last of his defenses. It was not about desire, not for her. It was about dignity. It was about reclaiming a piece of herself that Frank Dobbs had tried to steal before he had even laid full claim to it. He lay there until the first pale, gray light of dawn began to filter through the cabin's single window. The wind had finally died down, leaving behind a profound and ringing silence. The storm had passed. He turned his head on the pillow and looked at her. In the soft morning light, she looked younger, more fragile than ever. Her face was pale and tear-stained, But she was finally asleep, her features relaxed in exhaustion. A stray lock of damp, dark hair had fallen across her cheek. Slowly, carefully, he reached out a hand that trembled slightly. His rough, calloused fingers, so accustomed to the feel of rope and wood and leather, were infinitely gentle as he brushed the hair from her face. His knuckles grazed her soft skin, and a jolt went through him, a current of feeling so powerful it almost made him pull back. Her eyes fluttered open. They were the color of a stormy sea, deep and full of sorrow. But as she looked at him, something else flickered in their depths. A question. He leaned in, his heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. He pressed his lips to her forehead, a kiss as soft as a prayer, a promise of safety. He lingered there for a moment before drawing back. Her eyes were still fixed on his, her lips slightly parted. And then he lowered his head again. This time, his lips met hers. It was a soft, hesitant kiss, tentative and full of unspoken words. It was not a kiss of passion, but of comfort, of recognition. It was the meeting of two lonely, wounded souls in the quiet aftermath of a storm. For a long moment, the world seemed to stop. The cabin grew still, the only sound the gentle whisper of their breathing. And in that stillness, something new, something fragile and terrifying and beautiful, began to take root. News traveled on the wind in that part of the country, and it was a mean, gossiping wind. It did not take long for the story of the runaway bride to whip through Redemption Creek and curdle in the mouths of its citizens. The tale twisted as it went. By the time it reached the outlying homesteads, it was a sordid affair of seduction and betrayal. Frank Dobbs, a man whose pride was as vast and barren as his landholding, saw to that. The word came to them on the third day, carried by an old prospector named Silas, who sometimes traded with Jesse for supplies. He rode up to the cabin leading a pack mule, his face a leather mask of concern. He found Jesse reinforcing the corral fence while Evelyn, wearing a pair of Jesse's trousers that were belted tightly at the waist, was learning to properly stack firewood. "Jesse," Silas said, dismounting with a groan. His eyes flickered toward Evelyn, full of a sad curiosity, before settling back on the man he knew. "There's trouble brewing in town. Bad trouble." He pulled a crumpled notice from his saddlebag. It was a bounty poster, the ink still fresh. Jesse took it, his face unreadable as he scanned the words. Evelyn came closer, her heart beginning a slow, heavy drumbeat against her ribs. She read the notice over his shoulder. "Wanted, for the immediate return of my betrothed wife. Evelyn Hayes, unlawfully lured away and abducted by the thief and scoundrel Jesse Kane. A reward of $50 will be paid for information leading to her safe and unharmed return to my custody. Mr. Kane is also sought for the theft of a horse and personal effects. He is to be considered dangerous." The lies were so bald, so audacious, they stole the breath from her lungs. Abducted. A thief. They had twisted his kindness into a crime, her escape into a kidnapping. She was no longer a person. She was property, an item to be reclaimed, with a price tag attached. "He's a liar," she whispered, her voice shaking with a mixture of fear and fury. "He's a rich liar," Silas corrected gently. "And in this territory, that's a damn sight more powerful than a poor man's truth. Folks are talking. Jesse, Dobbs has the sheriff in his pocket. He's hiring men, forming a posse. They'll be scouring the whole valley." The old man's eyes were full of apology. "You best be careful. $50 is a lot of money to a man with an empty belly." After Silas had gone, a heavy silence fell over the small homestead. The wind sighed through the pines, a lonely, mournful sound. Evelyn looked at the cabin, this tiny pocket of safety that had begun to feel like a home, and saw it now as a trap. She looked at Jesse, at the quiet strength in his face, and saw the terrible danger she had brought to his door. "I have to leave," she said, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. I will not let him hurt you because of me. I can go north, find a different town where no one knows my name." Jesse had been staring out at the horizon, his jaw tight. He turned to her, his gray eyes intense. "And do what? Live your life looking over your shoulder? End up in another town with another man who thinks he can buy you?" He took a step closer, his voice low but fierce. "What Dobbs did to you was wrong. Evelyn, what he's doing now is wrong. Running from it won't make it right." "But they will come for you," she insisted, tears welling in her eyes. "They will call you a thief, or worse." "For what?" "For giving a cold woman a blanket." "No," he said, and his gaze was so steady it seemed to calm the frantic beating of her heart. "For giving a wronged woman a choice." He reached out and gently touched her arm, his fingers warm against her skin. "This is my home. I am not running from it. And you deserve protection, not shame. You'll stay." It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, as solid and unmovable as the mountains that rimmed the valley. And in that moment, Evelyn understood that this was no longer just about her survival. It was about his. They were tied together now, for better or for worse. So she stayed. The days that followed fell into a quiet, purposeful rhythm, a silent agreement to build a life in the face of the storm they knew was gathering. Their world shrank to the small patch of land Jesse called his own, the cabin, the corral, the creek that ran nearby, and the endless, watchful sky. They rose with the sun and worked until dusk, their shared labor a language that needed no words. They finished repairing the fence lines together, Evelyn learning to hold the rails steady while Jesse drove the posts deep into the stubborn earth. He taught her how to haul water from the creek, not with the dainty buckets of her past life, but with 2 heavy wooden pails yoked across her shoulders, a task that at first made her muscles scream in protest, but soon built a surprising strength in her arms and back. He showed her how to use an axe, his large hands guiding hers on the smooth, worn handle. He taught her the proper stance, the right way to breathe, the sharp, satisfying crack of the blade sinking into dry pine. Her first few attempts were clumsy, the axe glancing off the wood, but she did not give up. Soon, she could split a log with a clean, efficient stroke, the simple act a profound victory. She was providing for their warmth, for the fire that cooked their meals. She was no longer helpless. One afternoon, he brought out an old rifle, its stock dark and smooth with age. "You need to know how to use this," he said simply. The weight of it was terrifying, a heavy, cold piece of metal that represented a violence she could not comprehend. But she saw the seriousness in his eyes and knew he was right. He taught her how to load it, how to sight down the long barrel, how to squeeze the trigger without flinching. The first time she fired it, the recoil slammed the stock into her shoulder, a brutal, shocking force, and the sound of the shot was a deafening crack that echoed off the canyon walls. But she hit the tin can he had set on a fence post 50 yards away. A grim satisfaction settled in her. She was no longer just a woman who could run. She was a woman who could stand her ground. He taught her to ride, not in the constrained, side-saddle manner of a proper lady, but bareback, like he did. He led his steady mare, Daisy, into the corral and simply lifted her onto the horse's broad, warm back. The lack of a saddle was unnerving at first, every shift of the animal's powerful muscles a direct communication. But Jesse walked beside her, his hand resting lightly on the mare's neck, his calm voice a constant reassurance. Soon, she learned to move with the horse, to feel its rhythm, to trust its strength. Riding became an act of freedom, the wind in her hair a wild song, the world unfolding before her not as a threat, but as a possibility. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, exhausted and content, eating the simple stews he taught her to cook, and in the quiet hours after their meal, a new ritual began, one far more intimate than any of the day's shared labors. The bruises on her back, the violent fingerprints of Frank Dobbs, were slow to fade. They shifted in color from a deep, angry purple to a mottled green and yellow. Each night, Jesse would heat water and soak a clean cloth. He would sit behind her on the edge of the hearth, and she would lower the back of her borrowed flannel shirt. In the flickering firelight, he would gently, carefully, press the warm cloth to her wounded skin. His touch was always respectful, his fingers firm but tender. It was the touch of a healer, not a lover. But as the days turned into a week, and then two, the nature of that touch began to change. The careful distance he kept began to shrink. Sometimes, after he had tended the bruises, his hand would linger on her shoulder, his thumb stroking the unmarred skin there, a silent gesture of comfort that sent a tremor through her entire body. One night, as he was applying a soothing salve he'd made from pine resin and herbs, his fingers traced the outline of the fading marks. A deep shudder racked her frame, a response born not of pain, but of a confused and rising emotion she could not name. "I am afraid," she whispered to the fire, not daring to look at him. "I am afraid to be touched." She felt him grow still behind her. He did not speak for a long time. Then, his voice came, low and rough with an emotion he could not hide. "I know." He did not rush her. He did not offer empty reassurances. He simply finished his work, his touch as gentle as falling snow. When he was done, she did not pull her shirt back up. She sat there, her back to him, vulnerable and waiting. He moved from the hearth and sat beside her, not behind her. He did not try to kiss her or pull her into his arms. He just held out his hand, palm up, an open invitation. After a long, heart-stopping moment, she placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, his calloused palm a rough, warm anchor in the darkness. And that was how it was for many nights. He would tend her wounds, and then they would sit, sometimes holding hands, sometimes with his arm resting chastely around her shoulders. He never pushed for more. He simply held her, offering his strength and his patience, waiting for her to heal on the inside as well as the out. He let her set the pace, letting her learn that a man's touch could be a source of safety, not of fear. He waited until she was the one who leaned into him, who rested her head against his shoulder, who turned her face toward his. He waited until she was ready to ask for more. That night came when a new moon hung like a silver sliver in the sky, and the world outside the cabin was hushed and still. He had finished tending to her back, the bruises now little more than faint yellow shadows. She turned not away from him, but toward him. She looked into his eyes, her own reflecting the firelight, and she saw in his gaze a deep, trembling need that mirrored her own. It was she who leaned in first. It was she who closed the small distance between them and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was hesitant, a question asked in the dark. His response was a deep, shuddering breath, and then his arms were around her, pulling her close, his mouth answering hers with a hunger that had been held in check for what felt like a lifetime. Their coming together was not a perfect, seamless union. It was clumsy, emotional, and deeply, achingly human. It was filled with hesitant touches and whispered questions, with the ghosts of their pasts hovering in the shadows. It was a tangle of limbs and a meeting of scars, both visible and invisible. For Evelyn, it was the reclamation of her own body, a confirmation that she could be wanted for who she was, not for a price that had been paid. For Jesse, it was the slow, painful reopening of a heart he had long thought buried. It was hesitant and raw, but in the quiet darkness of the cabin, with the fire burning low, it was more real and more profound than any perfectly scripted romance. It was two broken people finding a way to be whole, together. Their fragile peace was shattered 2 days later. The sound came in the late afternoon, the unmistakable rhythm of shod horses, too many of them, moving at a steady, purposeful pace. Jesse heard them first. He was splitting wood by the corral, and he froze, his axe held mid-swing. His eyes, sharp and practiced, scanned the tree line. "Inside," he said to Evelyn, his voice a low, urgent command. Now. She did not question him. She ran to the cabin, her heart leaping into her throat. He followed her in, shutting the door and barring it. He went straight to the center of the room and kicked aside a small bearskin rug, revealing a dark square of wood set flush with the floor. A trapdoor. "Get in," he said, pulling it open. "Do not make a sound, no matter what you hear." The space below was small and dark, smelling of damp earth and stored roots. She scrambled down the short ladder without hesitation. Before he closed the door, he looked down at her, his face grim. "I will handle this." He shut the door, and she was plunged into absolute darkness. The sounds from above were magnified. Jesse dragging the rug back into place, the heavy tread of his boots as he walked to the door. And then, the sound she had been dreading, loud, aggressive pounding on the wood. "Jesse Kane," a rough voice shouted. "We know you're in there. Open up. Sheriff's business." She heard the bar being lifted, and the cabin door creaked open. "What can I do for you, gentlemen?" Jesse's voice was unnervingly calm, as if he were greeting neighbors. "We're looking for something that belongs to Mr. Dobbs," the man said. Evelyn recognized his voice, one of Dobbs's foremen, a brute named Caleb. "A woman, blonde hair, city clothes. We have reason to believe you're hiding her." "A woman?" Jesse's tone was one of mild, weary amusement. "Caleb, look around you. Does this look like a place a woman would stay? I've got enough trouble keeping myself fed without adding another mouth." There was the sound of heavy boots entering the cabin. Evelyn held her breath, pressing her hand over her mouth to stifle the sound. They were right above her. "We have a witness who saw you talking to her in town," Caleb snarled. "And a bounty notice that says you took her." "I gave a cold woman my coat," Jesse said, his voice hard now. "That's the beginning and the end of it. She ran out of that chapel like a spooked doe. For all I know, she's halfway to the next territory by now, or lying dead in a ditch from that storm. It's no business of mine." Evelyn could hear them moving around the small cabin, opening the chest, looking under the cot. Her entire body was clenched tight, a single knot of terror. If they found her, what would they do to Jesse? What would Dobbs do to her? "He's alone," another man said. "There's nothing here." "Check the lean-to," Caleb ordered. She listened to them stomp back outside, their voices fading as they searched the small barn. It felt like an eternity. Finally, their voices returned, full of frustrated anger. "Ain't nothing out there but his mare and some tack," one of them grumbled. "He's lying," Caleb insisted, but there was less conviction in his voice now. "We'll be back, Kane, and we'll be watching you. If we find out you've been hiding her, Dobbs will see you hang." The sound of their boots receded, followed by the jingle of harnesses and the thunder of hoofbeats as they rode away. Jesse waited a full minute after the sound had faded completely before he barred the door and pulled back the rug. Light streamed into the cellar. "They're gone," he said, his voice tight. She climbed out, her legs trembling so badly she nearly fell. He caught her, his hands strong and steady on her arms. She collapsed against him, burying her face in his chest, her body shaking with the aftermath of her fear. He held her, his arms a protective cage, stroking her hair until her trembling subsided. That night, after the danger had passed, they sat by the soft glow of a single oil lamp. The fear had stripped them bare, leaving behind a stark, undeniable truth. What they had was real, and it was in terrible danger. He reached across the table and took her hand. She looked up at him, her eyes shining in the lamplight. He leaned in and kissed her, a kiss that was deep and slow, a kiss born of shared peril and profound relief. It was a promise, a vow made without a preacher or a chapel, more sacred than any she had fled. When they finally broke apart, she was breathless. She looked around the small, sparse cabin that had become her whole world. It was a shelter, a sanctuary, but it was also a prison. I want to stay, she said, her voice clear and strong, a voice she had not known she possessed until now. She met his gaze, and for the first time, there was no fear in her eyes, only resolve, but not hidden. Her words, "I want to stay, but not hidden," became the creed of the new life they were attempting to build. They were a declaration of war against the shadows, and Jesse knew he had to be the one to ride out and meet the enemy on open ground. Hiding had failed. The truth was the only weapon they had left, however dull and pitted it might be against the polished steel of Frank Dobbs's influence. The next morning, he rose before dawn. He moved with a quiet purpose, checking his rifle, saddling his best horse, a strong buckskin gelding with a calm temperament. Evelyn watched him from the doorway of the cabin, a knot of fear tightening in her stomach. She had seen this look on a man's face only once before, in the eyes of a circuit preacher preparing to face down a saloon full of heathens. It was the look of grim, unshakable resolve. "You cannot go," she pleaded, her voice a raw whisper in the cold morning air. "They will not listen to you. They will arrest you." "They will not stop looking for you as long as you are considered stolen," he replied, his voice low and even as he cinched the saddle tight. "I have to tell the sheriff what happened, the truth of it, that you were not taken, but that you ran, that you had reason to run." He finally turned to face her, and the morning light caught the hardness in his eyes. "A man has to have his say. Evelyn, I will not let Frank Dobbs be the only one telling this story." He put his hand on her cheek, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "Bar the door behind me. Do not open it for anyone but me. I will be back before sundown." She wanted to scream, to cling to him and beg him not to go, but she saw the futility in it. This was his decision. Born of a deep-seated code of honor she was only just beginning to understand. So she nodded, her throat too tight for words, and watched him ride away, a solitary figure against the rising sun, growing smaller and smaller until the vast, empty landscape swallowed him whole. The ride to Redemption Creek was a lonely one. The town that had once been a place of neutral commerce now felt like enemy territory. As he rode down the main street, windows seemed to darken. Conversations on porches fell silent. Men who had known him for years, who had shared a drink with him or helped him drive cattle, now looked at him with suspicion, their eyes hard and questioning. They saw the man from the bounty poster, the thief, the scoundrel. They did not see the man who had given a desperate woman shelter from a storm. The sheriff's office was a small, stuffy room that smelled of stale cigar smoke and cheap whiskey. Sheriff Miller was a heavy man, his belly straining the buttons of his star-pinned vest. He sat behind a large desk cluttered with papers, his face flushed and sweaty despite the morning cool. He did not look up when Jesse entered. "Kane," he grunted, shuffling a stack of documents. "I figured you'd be halfway to Mexico by now. Would have been the smart play." "I am not a thief, Sheriff, and I am not running," Jesse said, his voice calm and steady. He remained standing, his hat in his hands, a gesture of respect that was not returned. "I came to tell you what really happened with Miss Hayes." "I already know what happened," Miller said, finally looking up, his eyes small and mean. "I have a signed complaint from Mr. Dobbs. Says you abducted his lawfully betrothed wife right out from under the preacher's nose." "She was not his wife," Jesse countered, keeping his voice even. "And I did not abduct her. She ran. She was terrified of him. Miller, you know Dobbs's reputation as well as I do." The sheriff leaned back in his chair, which groaned in protest. He made a great show of cleaning his fingernails with a pocket knife. "What I know," he said slowly, "is that Mr. Dobbs is a respected citizen of this community, a man of property, and what I have is a signed marriage contract and a dozen witnesses who say she was at the chapel to marry him. The law is particular about contracts, Kane, and it is very particular about property." The word hung in the air, ugly and obscene. "She is not a horse to be bought. Sheriff, she is a woman." She is a mail-order bride who broke her contract, Miller shot back, his voice rising. And you are the man who's been hiding her. That's called harboring, and it's a crime. Now, you tell me where she is, and maybe, just maybe, Dobbs will be lenient. Jesse felt a cold fury rise in him, but he tamped it down. Anger would not help him here. She came to my cabin in the middle of a storm. Sheriff, she was frightened and soaked to the bone. What was I supposed to do? Turn her away? Let her die in the mud? You were supposed to bring her back to town, Miller said, slamming his knife down on the desk. You were supposed to turn her over to her legal guardian, which, according to the papers he filed, is Frank Dobbs. Instead, you kept her for what? Kane, for yourself? The accusation was a slap in the face. Jesse's hands tightened on the brim of his hat. This is not about justice, he said, his voice dangerously low. This is about the money Dobbs pays you to keep you in his pocket. The sheriff's face turned a shade of purple. He lumbered to his feet, his hand resting on the butt of the pistol at his hip. You are done in this town. Kane, there is a circuit judge arriving this afternoon. He will be signing a warrant for your arrest. If I were you, I'd get on that horse of yours and ride until you forget the name of this territory. Now get out of my office. Jesse stood his ground for a moment longer, a silent battle of wills playing out across the dusty room. But he knew he had lost. The law was not blind. It was just looking the other way. He turned without another word and walked out, the sheriff's smug breathing loud in his ears. The news of the warrant, once signed, spread like a prairie fire. It was carried out of town by a traveling peddler, a wiry man named Abernathy who stopped at Jesse's homestead late that afternoon. Hoping to sell some pots and pans, he found Evelyn pacing anxiously by the corral, her eyes constantly scanning the horizon. Ma'am, he said, tipping his hat. He was a kind-faced man with worried eyes. I just came from town. I think you ought to know. They have issued a warrant for Jesse Kane, for harboring a runaway wife. They are calling it kidnapping. The sheriff is forming a posse to come and arrest him. The peddler's words were like stones, each one striking her and stealing a piece of her breath. It had happened. Her worst fear had come to pass. She had not saved herself. She had only doomed him. The weight of her guilt was a physical thing, a crushing pressure on her chest. She bought a small tin of tea from the man, her hands trembling as she counted out the coins, her mind racing. As soon as Abernathy's wagon was out of sight, her decision was made. It was a terrible, crystalline clarity. She had been the cause of this, and she would be the one to end it. Jesse had given her a choice at the chapel. Now, she had to make her own. She went inside the cabin, the place that had been her sanctuary, and found a piece of paper and a nub of charcoal. Her hand shook so much she could barely form the letters. Jesse, they are coming for you because of me. I cannot let that happen. I am going back. I will tell them the truth, that you did nothing but show me kindness. This is the only way to fix the wrong I have done to you. Do not follow me. You gave me a choice. Now this is mine. Evelyn. She left the note on the table where he would be sure to see it. Outside, the sky was beginning to bruise with the familiar colors of an approaching storm. It seemed fitting. She saddled Daisy, the gentle mare moving placidly under her hurried, clumsy hands, with one last heartbreaking look at the small cabin. She mounted the horse and rode east, toward the sprawling, ominous ranch of Frank Dobbs. She rode into the wind and the rain, not as a victim running from her fate, but as a sacrifice walking toward it. She did not have to ride all the way to the house. As she reached the edge of his property, marked by a new, imposing barbed wire fence, two riders appeared over a rise. It was Caleb and another of Dobbs's men. They had been watching for her. A slow, cruel smile spread across Caleb's face as he saw her. Well, well, he drawled, blocking her path. Look what the storm blew in. The little runaway bird decided to fly home to her cage. Before she could speak, before she could state her purpose, He was off his horse. Grabbing Daisy's reins and hauling her roughly to the ground, she landed hard, the breath knocked out of her. Dobbs himself appeared a moment later, riding a magnificent black stallion. He looked down at her, his face a mask of triumphant fury. "So," he boomed, dismounting. "You tired of your little adventure? Tired of sleeping in the dirt with that stable hand?" He grabbed her by the arm, his fingers digging into her flesh like talons, and dragged her to her feet. "You have caused me a great deal of embarrassment, girl, and a great deal of expense. I came to turn myself in," she said, her voice shaking but defiant. "To clear Jesse Kane's name. He did nothing wrong." Dobbs laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "His name is Mud, and he will hang for what he has done. And you will learn what it means to be a wife. My wife." He took a piece of rope from his saddle and, with brutal efficiency, tied her wrists together in front of her. He pulled the knot tight, the rough fibers biting into her skin. He threw her back on Daisy, heedless of her bound hands, and led the horse toward the main house, a large, dark structure that loomed like a prison on the horizon. He did not take her to the front door. He led her around back, to a heavy, angled door set into the ground, a cellar. He pulled her from the horse and dragged her down the stone steps into the cold, musty dark. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. He shoved her into the center of the small, windowless room and stood over her, his large frame blocking the only light from the open door above. "This is where my last wife, Martha, spent her final months," he boasted, his voice echoing in the small space. "She had a disobedient streak, too. I cured her of it." He leaned in close, his whiskey-sour breath hot on her face. "You belong to me now, Evelyn. The law says so. A husband has his rights, and down here, no one is going to question them." He turned and stomped back up the stairs, slamming the heavy wooden door shut and plunging her into absolute, terrifying blackness. She heard the scrape of a heavy bar sliding into place. She was a prisoner. Jesse returned to the cabin just as the sun was setting, casting long, bloody streaks across the storm clouds. The sight that greeted him was one of utter desolation. The door was unbarred. Daisy was gone from the corral. The cabin was cold and empty, the fire long dead. A profound and terrible silence screamed at him. Then he saw the note. He snatched it from the table, his hands trembling as he read her neat, careful script. The words were a knife in his gut. Foolish, brave, wonderful woman. She had walked back into the lion's den to save him. The fear he had felt for his own safety was nothing compared to the icy terror that now gripped him for hers. That terror quickly burned away, replaced by a white-hot rage, an anger so pure and so cold it was like a shard of ice in his heart. He did not hesitate. He did not wait for the storm to pass. He grabbed his rifle, a box of cartridges, and a long hunting knife. He strode out to the corral, saddled his buckskin, and swung into the saddle. He rode out into the teeth of the storm, a man no longer guided by honor or reason, but by a single, desperate, all-consuming purpose: to get her back. The ride through the night was a blind, furious chase. The wind howled and the rain came down in blinding sheets, turning the trail to a treacherous river of mud. But he rode with a reckless abandon, his horse sure-footed and powerful beneath him, both of them driven by the storm inside their rider. He reached the Dobbs estate near midnight. The main house was mostly dark, save for a single lamp burning in a downstairs window. Lights also burned in the bunkhouse where Dobbs's men slept. He could not ride in the front. He circled the property, his movements silent and predatory, and found a spot where the fence bordered a thick stand of cottonwoods. He dismounted, tied his horse, and slipped through the wire, a ghost in the rain. He made his way to the back of the house, keeping to the shadows. Through a window, he could see Dobbs sitting at a large dining table, a bottle of whiskey and a glass in front of him, a look of smug satisfaction on his face. There was no sign of Evelyn. A cold dread settled in Jesse's stomach. He remembered the stories about Martha. He crept toward the back of the house and saw it, the heavy, barred cellar door. He knew, with a certainty that made his blood run cold, that she was down there. He did not try to be quiet. He kicked the cellar door, the wood groaning under the impact of his boot. He kicked it again and again, the sound echoing like gunshots in the night. Lights flared in the bunkhouse. A dog started barking furiously. The main house door burst open and Dobbs stood there, silhouetted against the light, a pistol in his hand. "Kane!" he roared. "I knew you'd be fool enough to come!" "Where is she, Dobbs?" Jesse yelled, his rifle leveled at the man's chest. "She's where a disobedient wife belongs," Dobbs sneered, and he fired his pistol. The shot went wide, splintering the wood of the fence behind Jesse. Jesse fired back, not at Dobbs, but at the lamp inside the house, plunging the doorway into darkness. Men were pouring out of the bunkhouse now, shouting and firing blindly into the night. Jesse took cover behind a watering trough as bullets whizzed past him. He needed to get to that door. Under the cover of the chaos, he sprinted across the muddy yard. A searing pain exploded in his left shoulder, staggering him. He'd been hit. He ignored it, the adrenaline and the rage a fire in his veins, and threw his full, desperate weight against the cellar door one last time. The bar splintered. The door crashed open. "Evelyn!" he yelled into the darkness. He heard a cry from below, her voice, small and terrified. He started down the steps just as Caleb appeared from the side of the house, a shotgun in his hands. Jesse turned and fired the rifle from his hip. The shot caught Caleb in the leg, and he went down with a scream. Jesse scrambled down the steps and found her, huddled in the corner, her wrists still bound. He pulled out his hunting knife and sawed through the ropes in a single, furious motion. "Jesse, you are hurt!" she cried, seeing the dark stain spreading across his shirt. "We have to go," he said, pulling her to her feet. "Now." They clambered out of the cellar and into a firefight. He pushed her behind him, firing his rifle to keep Dobbs's men back, and they ran for the trees where he'd left his horse. The moon broke through the clouds, bathing the scene in a cold, stark light. They were exposed. They reached the horse, and he threw her into the saddle before mounting behind her, his wounded shoulder screaming in protest. He spurred the buckskin into a gallop, and they crashed through the woods, away from the shouting and the gunfire. They rode until the sounds of the ranch were gone, until the only sounds were the horse's labored breathing and the wind in the trees. They did not stop until they found a small, shallow cave carved into the bank of a rushing river, a place where they could hide. He slid from the saddle, nearly collapsing from the pain and blood loss. Evelyn was at his side instantly, helping him into the relative shelter of the cave. She was barefoot, her dress torn, her face streaked with dirt and tears. She looked at the blood soaking his shirt, and her face crumpled. "We have to stop the bleeding," she said, her voice shaking. With trembling hands, she ripped a long strip from the hem of her petticoat. She gently peeled the blood-soaked fabric of his shirt away from the wound, a nasty, ragged hole in his shoulder. Her touch was tender as she cleaned it as best she could with the river water and bound it tightly with the makeshift bandage. When she was done, she sank to the floor of the cave, her strength finally giving out. She looked at him, his face pale and etched with pain in the moonlight. She looked at her own torn clothes, at the raw, red marks on her wrists. This was all her fault, all this violence, all this pain. She had brought a war to this quiet man's doorstep. Tears streamed down her face, hot and silent. "After all of this," she whispered, her voice breaking with a despair that was deeper than any she had known before. "After what I have cost you, do you still want me?" He did not answer her question with words. He was too weak, his body already succumbing to the fever that was beginning to cloud his mind. But as she knelt beside him in the cold, damp cave, his good hand trembling with effort, came up and found hers, his fingers, though weak, curled around her own, a desperate, anchoring grip. He met her tear-filled gaze, and in the depths of his gray eyes, clouded with pain, she saw her answer. It was a look of such profound, unwavering certainty that it stole the breath from her lungs. It said everything words could not. It said, always. By morning, the fever had taken full hold. He was shivering uncontrollably one moment, burning with a dry, consuming heat the next. He tossed his head back and forth, muttering names she did not know. Sarah, his father, a horse named Blue, his mind wandering through the fever-haunted landscapes of his past. The wound in his shoulder was angry and inflamed, a dark red that spread outwards under the skin. The makeshift bandage was soaked through. Evelyn knew, with a terrifying certainty, that if she did not get proper medicine, he would die here, in this cold, nameless cave by the river. The thought of returning to Redemption Creek was a cold knot of dread in her stomach. It was the source of all her pain, a town of hostile eyes and whispering tongues. But the image of Jesse, pale and sweating in the half-light, his life slipping away with every ragged breath, was a far greater terror. She had brought this upon him. She would not be the one who let him die. She tore another strip from her petticoat and soaked it in the cold river water, laying it on his forehead. "I will be back," she whispered to his unhearing ears. "I promise, Jesse, I will be back." She took his horse. Riding into town on the buckskin gelding was a risk, a clear signal of her connection to him. But Daisy was gone and she had no other choice. She pulled her hair back severely and tried to arrange her torn dress to look less like the clothes of a fugitive. It was a useless gesture. The moment she rode down the main street, a hush fell over the town. Conversations on the boardwalk ceased. Faces appeared in windows. She was a pariah. A ghost returned to haunt them. She felt their stares like physical blows. They were not just looks of curiosity, but of condemnation. She heard the whispers as she passed the saloon, sharp and cruel as shards of glass. "There she is, Dobbs's property, the one that got Kane shot. They had already tried and convicted them both." She tied the horse in front of the general store and took a deep, steadying breath before pushing the door open. The bell above it gave a cheerful, mocking jingle. The store was warm and smelled of coffee beans, leather, and dried apples. A few women were gathered at the counter, but they fell silent as she entered, clutching their baskets and turning their backs to her, creating a solid wall of righteous disapproval. Behind the counter stood a woman in her late 50s, her hair pulled back in a severe gray bun. Her face was a roadmap of hard lines and old sorrows. This was Mrs. Gable, the owner. She had a reputation for being as tough and unyielding as the winter ground. She looked at Evelyn, her eyes missing nothing, taking in the torn dress, the raw marks on her wrists, and the desperate fear she could not hide. "What do you want, Mrs.?" Gable asked, her voice flat and devoid of welcome. I need medicine," Evelyn said, her voice barely a whisper. "Carbolic acid, and bandages, and laudanum, if you have it." "For who?" one of the other women sneered. "For that thief you ran off with?" Evelyn ignored her, keeping her eyes fixed on the store owner. "Please," she said simply. "He is hurt badly. He has a fever." "Mrs.?" Gable's face remained a stony mask. She turned and began gathering the items from the shelves behind her. The carbolic acid, a roll of clean linen for bandages, a small, dark bottle of laudanum. She placed them on the counter with a thud. "That will be $3, she said, her voice still cold. Evelyn's heart sank. She had only a few coins left. It was not nearly enough. The other women in the store exchanged smug, satisfied glances. But then, something strange happened. As Mrs. Gable reached for a brown paper sack. She turned her back to the room for a moment. In that brief second, her movements were a blur. She slid a small sack of flour, a slab of bacon, and a tin of coffee off a lower shelf and into the bag with the medicine. When she turned back around, her face was as hard as ever. $3, she repeated, her eyes meeting Evelyn's. And in that look, in that single fleeting moment of connection, Evelyn saw not coldness, but a deep, hidden well of understanding. She saw the ghost of her own past reflected in the old woman's eyes. Evelyn placed her meager coins on the counter. "This is all I have," she whispered, her voice thick with shame. "Mrs." Gable scooped the coins into the till without counting them. "It is enough," she said gruffly. She pushed the heavy sack toward Evelyn. "Now get out! You are scaring off my customers!" As Evelyn turned to leave, her sack clutched to her chest like a prayer. She saw Caleb and another of Dobbs's men drinking at a table in the corner of the saloon across the street. Caleb was watching the general store. He saw her. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second, and a slow, cruel smile spread across his face. He knew. He knew Jessie was out there somewhere, wounded, and he knew she had just revealed their desperation. A new, colder fear gripped her. She hurried to the horse, untied the reins, and rode out of town. Not looking back, she pushed the horse hard, praying she was not being followed, praying she could get back to the cave in time. She was not followed. They were more cunning than that. They did not want her. They wanted Jessie. Caleb had seen which direction she had come from. He knew the general location of the cabin. It was all the information he needed. Jessie drifted in and out of a fevered consciousness. He was vaguely aware of a growing warmth, an orange light flickering against his closed eyelids. The air grew thick and acrid, smelling of smoke. A roar began to build, a hungry, consuming sound that was not part of his fever dream. His eyes snapped open. The cabin was on fire. Flames were licking up the far wall, devouring the dry timber with a terrible speed. The roof was already burning, embers raining down like malevolent stars. He tried to get up, but his body was a leaden weight, his shoulder a nexus of pure agony. He was trapped. He was going to die. He had resigned himself to the inevitable, his mind already beginning to fog over again. When the cabin door was kicked open, a figure stood silhouetted against the roaring inferno outside. A man with long, dark hair and the quiet, efficient movements of a hunter. It was Nakai, an Apache trader Jessie had encountered on the trail several years before. Nakai's horses had been lame, and he had been out of water. Jessie had given him a full canteen and half his jerky and had not asked for anything in return. It was a kindness Nakai had never forgotten. The trader took in the scene in a single, sweeping glance. The fire, the wounded man on the cot. Without a word, he crossed the room, seemingly impervious to the smoke and heat, and hauled Jessie to his feet. Jessie cried out as the movement sent a fresh wave of agony through his shoulder, but he leaned on the smaller man, his legs barely able to hold him. Together, they stumbled out of the burning cabin and into the night, just as the roof collapsed inwards with a deafening crash, sending a shower of sparks into the sky. Nakai helped him onto his own pony and led him away from the fire, into the deep shadows of the forest, leaving the cabin to be consumed, a funeral pyre for a life that was now gone forever. Evelyn saw the smoke first, a dark plume against the bruised evening sky. Rising from the direction of the cabin, a terrible, soul-crushing certainty washed over her. She spurred the horse onward, her heart pounding with a dread so profound it felt like a physical blow. She had led them right to him. She rode not to the cabin, but to a small, hidden clearing they had agreed upon as a meeting place in case of trouble. She waited there, the heavy sack of supplies clutched in her lap, her eyes fixed on the column of smoke, her mind a maelstrom of guilt and terror. She waited for what felt like a lifetime. And then, he appeared. He was riding double on a wiry pony, slumped against the back of an Apache man she had never seen before. Jessie was pale, covered in soot, his shirt singed, but he was alive. The Apache trader brought him to the clearing and helped him dismount, easing him to the ground. The two men exchanged a few words in a language she did not understand, a quiet conversation of nods and hand gestures. Then, with a last, solemn look at Jesse, Nakai mounted his pony and melted back into the woods as silently as he had appeared. Evelyn rushed to Jesse's side, her hands fluttering over him, checking his wound, his face, as if to reassure herself he was real. "The cabin," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I am so sorry. Jesse, they saw me in town. I led them to you." He looked up at her, his eyes clear for the first time in 2 days, the fever having broken with the shock and the cold night air. He saw the guilt that was crushing her. He reached up with his good hand and cupped her cheek, his touch surprisingly steady. "It was just a place. Evelyn," he said, his voice a hoarse rasp. "They did not get you. That is all that matters." They had lost everything. The cabin, the few tools he owned, the small comforts they had begun to build together. All they had left were 2 horses, a rifle, and the clothes on their backs. They were fugitives, with a bounty on his head and a madman hunting them. Redemption Creek was no longer an option. This entire part of the territory was poison to them. "There is a place," he said, after she had cleaned and dressed his wound with the new supplies and forced some hot coffee into him. "Across the canyon, a valley that is hard to get to. Old trappers used to talk about it, said it was a good place to disappear. And so they rode. They traveled for days, keeping to the high ridges and the hidden game trails, avoiding roads and settlements. It was a hard journey. Jesse was still weak, and the wound in his shoulder ached with a deep, persistent pain. But with every mile they put between themselves and their past, a weight seemed to lift from them. They were no longer running from something. They were riding towards something. One evening, as dusk was settling over the rugged landscape, they saw the faint wisp of smoke from a campfire in a valley below them. It was not a single fire, but several, scattered among a grove of cottonwood trees. Jesse was wary. But they were low on food and their horses needed rest. They approached with caution. What they found was not a camp of outlaws or prospectors. It was a small, hidden community, a settlement that did not exist on any map. It was a collection of rough-hewn cabins and canvas tents, a place of last resort for the outcasts of the world. They were met by a tall, stern-faced woman with iron-gray hair and a shotgun held loosely in the crook of her arm. "This is private land," she said, her voice firm but not unkind. "State your business." "We are just passing through," Jesse said, his hand resting near his own rifle. "We mean no harm." The woman's eyes moved from Jesse's worn face to Evelyn's, and her expression softened slightly. She saw the same look in Evelyn that she saw in the faces of all the women who found their way to this place, a mixture of fear and exhaustion, but with a hard-won core of resilience. "My name is Hannah," she said, lowering the shotgun, "and this is Sanctuary." Over the next few days, they learned the story of the place. It had been started by Hannah, who had fled a brutal husband in the East, and a handful of other women who had similar stories. Over the years, it had grown. Freedmen escaping the lingering chains of the South, families who had lost their land to cheats and swindlers, women who had been cast out for being too independent or for simply choosing the wrong man. It was a community of misfits, bound together by their shared experience of being broken by the world outside. Here, for the first time, Evelyn felt a sense of belonging. These women understood her without her needing to speak a word of her story. She saw her own pain and her own strength reflected in their eyes. She began to find a new purpose. She had her education, her ability to read and write, skills that were rare and valuable here. She started a small school for the children. She used her knowledge of basic medicine, gleaned from her mother, to tend to the sick and injured. She taught the other women how to sew and mend, how to make their rough-spun clothes last a little longer. She was no longer just a survivor. She was a healer, a teacher, She was helping to build a new world out of the wreckage of their old ones. Jesse, too, found his place. His strength and his skill with an axe were needed. He helped build new cabins, stronger and more weatherproof than the tents. He helped wrangle the community's small herd of horses and taught the younger boys how to hunt and track. His quiet, steady presence was a balm to this community of wounded souls. He was not a leader, but a protector, a builder. They were not husband and wife. There was no preacher, no marriage license to bind them. But what they had was deeper and more real than any piece of paper. They were partners, bound by respect and a love that had been forged in fire and fear. They had carved out a life in a place that society had forgotten, among a people that society had thrown away, and for the first time, they felt truly free. One night, they lay together on a blanket under the vast, star-dusted sky, a little ways from the main camp. A gentle breeze whispered through the pines, and the distant sound of a fiddle being played drifted up from the settlement. It was a peaceful sound, a sound of life stubbornly, beautifully, continuing. Evelyn rested her head on his good shoulder, her hand resting on his chest. She thought back to that terrible, rain-swept night, the night that had destroyed her life and, in doing so, had given her a new one. "That cabin?" she said softly, her voice full of a quiet wonder. That night, it was not a mistake. He turned his head and looked at her, his eyes full of a love so deep it seemed to hold the whole night sky in them. He brought his hand up to cover hers. "No," he replied, his voice a low, steady rumble. It was the beginning. The seasons turned, each one etching new lines onto the land and the people who lived upon it. Winter snows blanketed the valley in a profound silence, and spring brought a riot of wildflowers that seemed to mock the harshness of the earth. Summers were long and hot, filled with the drone of insects and the hard work of the harvest, and autumn painted the cottonwoods in shades of gold and fire. 5 years passed, then 7, then 10. The world outside Sanctuary changed in ways they only heard about through the whispers of passing travelers. But within their hidden valley, life settled into a rhythm as steady and dependable as the turning of the stars. Jesse and Evelyn lived quietly, their love a constant, gentle flame in the heart of the small community. The scar on his shoulder was a faint, silvery mark, a permanent reminder of the violence that had forged their beginning. He moved with a slight stiffness on cold mornings, but his strength had returned, and it was a strength he now used to build rather than to fight. His hair was threaded with gray at the temples, and the lines around his eyes had deepened, but they were lines of laughter now, not just of squinting into the sun. He was the solid, unshakable center of their small world. Evelyn had blossomed. The timid, terrified woman who had stumbled into his cabin was gone, replaced by a woman of quiet confidence and profound compassion. The West had not broken her, it had scoured her down to her strongest self. She was the heart of Sanctuary, the one people sought out for counsel, for medicine, for a kind word. She moved with a purpose that came from knowing her own worth, a worth that had nothing to do with contracts or dowries. Yet, a part of them always watched the road. Every time a stranger rode into the valley, a shadow of the old fear would pass between them, a silent, shared question. They knew that the world was wide, and that a man like Frank Dobbs had a long memory and a reach that could stretch across territories. Their peace was a hard-won, precious thing, and they never forgot how easily it could be shattered. The news, when it finally came, arrived not with a posse or a gunshot, but on the lips of the traveling peddler, Abernathy, who made a yearly trek to their hidden valley. He sat by their fire, sipping a cup of Evelyn's strong coffee, his face full of the weary gossip of the trail. "Had to pass by Redemption Creek on my way here," he said, shaking his head. "That place is drying up, but you will not believe the news. Frank Dobbs is dead." A profound stillness settled over the small cabin. Evelyn's hand, which had been mending a shirt, stopped mid-stitch. Jesse, who had been cleaning his rifle, slowly set it down. How? Jesse asked, his voice low. Abernathy shrugged, taking another sip of coffee. That is the thing. No one is quite sure. They found him at the bottom of a ravine on his own property. His neck broken, his horse was back at the stable, still saddled. Some say a rival rancher he was feuding with over water rights finally had enough. Some say it was one of his own men, a fella he had cheated in a card game. I even heard a rumor that it was the ghost of his second wife, come back for vengeance. The peddler leaned forward, his voice dropping. The truth is, no one much cared to investigate. The sheriff asked a few questions, wrote it up as an accident, and the whole town seemed to breathe a little easier. Man like that makes a lot of enemies. Sooner or later, one of them comes to collect. After Abernathy left, Jesse and Evelyn sat in silence for a long time, the fire crackling in the hearth. The ghost that had haunted them for a decade was finally laid to rest. Evelyn did not feel joy, nor did she feel a thirst for vengeance satisfied. She felt only a slow, quiet unwinding of a knot that had been tied in her soul for so long she had forgotten it was there. She reached across the space between them and took Jesse's hand. He squeezed it, his thumb stroking her knuckles. They did not need to speak. The long night was finally over. In the years that followed, the legend of their small settlement grew. It was never a town, never a place you could find on a map. It was a whisper. A rumor passed between the broken and the lost. Sanctuary, a place of safety for women fleeing brutal husbands, for families driven from their land, for anyone who needed to disappear from a world that had no place for them. The narrow, hidden pass into the valley became a path of pilgrimage. They did not have laws, but they had rules. You worked for what you ate. You respected your neighbors, and you never, ever spoke of sanctuary to outsiders. One cool autumn afternoon, Evelyn sat at the small wooden desk Jesse had built for her, a piece of paper and a bottle of ink before her. It had been more than 12 years since she had last seen her family, since she had been the dutiful daughter who had agreed to sell herself to save them. For all those years, she had carried the weight of their memory, the pain of their sacrifice, and the shame of her failure. Now, with Dobbs gone, she felt a need to finally bridge that silence, to tell them the truth of her life. Her hand trembled as she dipped the pen in the ink. "Dearest mother and father," she began. She wrote for hours, the words pouring out of her, a dam of unspoken grief and hard-won joy finally breaking. She told them everything. She wrote of Frank Dobbs, of his cruelty and the fear that had driven her into the storm. She wrote of a kind stranger who had offered her shelter, a man named Jesse Kane. She confessed that she had not married, that she had lived with this man as his wife in the eyes of God, if not the law. She wrote of the fire, of their flight, and of the hidden valley where they had found a new life. "I know this is not the life you envisioned for me," she wrote, a tear splashing onto the page and smudging the ink. "I know I have broken my promise to you, but I have found a life here that is more real and more honest than any I could have bought with Dobbs's money. I am not a fine lady in a big house. I am a woman who knows how to split wood and mend a fence and tend to a fever. I am strong. I am respected. And I am loved. I pray you can find it in your hearts to forgive me and to be happy for me." She sealed the letter and gave it to Abernathy on his next trip, along with a small pouch of coins to pay for the postage. She asked him to mail it from a town far to the east, to protect the secret of their location. Then she waited. Every time the peddler returned, her heart would leap with a desperate, childish hope, but he never had a letter for her. She never got a reply. The silence from the east was a quiet, aching grief, the final closing of a door to her past. She had to accept that the family she had tried to save had written her out of their lives. Her family was here now, in this valley, a motley collection of outcasts and runaways, bound not by blood, but by shared survival. One afternoon, a few years later, a lone rider was spotted coming down the pass. It was a young woman, no more than 17, on a sway-backed nag that looked ready to collapse. She was heavily pregnant. her face pale and streaked with dirt, her eyes wide with a hunted animal fear. Hannah, whose eyes were still the sharpest in the valley, met her at the edge of the settlement, her shotgun held in its customary place. Evelyn walked out to join her. She looked at the young woman, at her torn dress and her chapped hands, and she saw herself, all those years ago, stepping off a stagecoach into a world of wind and dust and fear. "My name is Clara," the young woman whispered, her voice trembling. She swayed in the saddle, clearly exhausted. "My husband, I had to run." She did not need to say more. Her story was written in the bruises that were faintly visible on her cheek and in the terror that swam in her eyes. "I heard someone in the next territory said there was a place, a safe place." Hannah looked at Evelyn, a silent question in her eyes. Evelyn stepped forward, her heart aching with a profound and painful empathy. She reached up and placed a hand on the young woman's arm, her touch gentle and reassuring. She looked up into Clara's frightened face and offered her the same words that had been her own salvation, so long ago. "You look cold, ma'am," she said, her voice soft. "Best to get inside before the storm really lets loose. The sky's looking mean." That night, after Clara was settled in a warm cabin, fed and cared for, Jessie and Evelyn sat before the fire in their own small home. It was a new cabin, one Jessie had built with his own hands, larger and sturdier than the first one, with a real glass window that looked out over the valley. The wind moaned outside, a familiar, lonely sound that no longer held any terror for them. It was just the song of the wilderness, the soundtrack to their lives. Evelyn was quiet, her thoughts far away. Jessie watched her, his gaze full of a deep, knowing love. He knew what the arrival of the young woman had stirred up in her. She turned to him, her eyes shining in the firelight. She took his hand, the one that was calloused and scarred from years of hard work, the hand that had saved her, and she placed it gently on her own stomach, beneath his palm. He could feel the slight, firm curve that had not been there a month before. She looked into his eyes, a slow, beautiful smile spreading across her face. "You will stay, won't you?" she asked, her voice a soft, loving murmur, echoing her own desperate plea from a lifetime ago. He leaned forward and rested his forehead against hers, his other hand coming up to cup her face. The firelight danced in his eyes, and in their depths, she saw a love as vast and as endless as the western sky. He answered, his voice a low, rough promise, a vow that was more sacred than any words ever spoken in a church. "I have always been yours." The fire cast their two silhouettes onto the rough log wall, two figures joined as one. Outside, the wind howled, and the vast, unforgiving land stretched out into the darkness. But inside the small cabin, there was only the quiet flicker of the flames, the warmth of two souls who had found their sanctuary not in a place, but in each other. They were the survivors, the healers, the lovers, a testament to a love so fierce it had dared to break every boundary and build a new world in the ruins. Thank you for gathering around the campfire with us tonight. Let us know where you are listening from in the comments so we can all connect. And be sure to subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts in English.